In 22 years working criminal forensics, I have never, not once, seen evidence this perfectly arranged. And that should have been the first warning sign. Andrew Blaze was born on a Tuesday in early November, during the kind of storm that knocks out power lines and rewrites plans. His mother, Carol Blaze, a retired school librarian, later said she always believed that the timing meant something, that her son came into the world already fighting against conditions beyond his control. He grew up in Port Meridian, a mid-sized city in the Pacific Northwest where the rain never fully stops and neither does the crime. It was not a wealthy town, but it was a proud one, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors, left their doors unlocked a little too long, and believed that a man's reputation was the only currency that truly mattered. Andrew's father, Raymond Blaze, worked as a beat cop for 19 years. He was the type of officer people actually trusted, the kind who remembered your name, showed up at your door when things went sideways, and never once used his badge as a shortcut. Andrew idolized him. From the age of 9, he wanted nothing else. He was sharp, even then. Quietly sharp, the kind of sharp that doesn't announce itself. His 6th-grade teacher, Mrs. Lorraine Halpert, once told his mother that Andrew didn't just solve problems. He noticed them before anyone else did. Most kids look at a room, she said. Andrew reads it. He went on to study criminology at the University of Washington, graduating in the top 12% of his class. He joined the Port Meridian Police Department at 23. Within 4 years, he had cracked 3 cold cases that senior detectives had quietly given up on, including a disappearance that had sat unsolved for 11 years. By all visible measures, Andrew Blaze was exactly where he was supposed to be. But life rarely holds its shape that cleanly. In the winter of his 7th year on the force, Andrew responded to a warehouse fire that turned out to be a deliberate trap, a crime scene staged to lure first responders into a secondary explosion. 2 officers died. Andrew survived, but something inside him did not. The trauma rewired him in ways that no debrief, no department therapist, and no amount of time ever fully reached. He began experiencing blackouts. Not the kind from exhaustion or drinking, something deeper, more clinical. Hours would vanish from his memory without warning, leaving nothing behind except a sick, hollow feeling in whatever state he found himself in when he came back. Muddy shoes, a half-eaten meal, a door he didn't remember opening. He resigned from the department quietly, without ceremony. No farewell gathering, no commendation ceremony, just a signed form and a box of desk belongings carried out to a truck in the rain. He set up a private investigation firm out of a second-floor office on Caldwell Street. The sign on the door was modest. The caseload was modest. His life had contracted to something he could manage, or so he believed. He was 37 years old. He lived alone. He kept the curtains drawn and the phone mostly off. He told himself he preferred the quiet. Then, on the 14th of March, a woman knocked on his door at 11:30 at night. Her name was Jessica Anthony. She was 26 years old, wearing a dark knit sweater damp from the rain, her brown hair pulled back in a loose knot with strands clinging to her face. Her wide brown eyes were glassy, not quite crying, but balanced right at the edge of it. Her lips were parted slightly, like she had rehearsed what she was going to say, but lost the words the moment he opened the door. She told him her sister was missing. She told him the police weren't moving fast enough. She told him she had nobody else to turn to. Andrew looked at her, at the trembling hands, the fragile posture, the pure devastation written across every feature, and he saw exactly what he was meant to see. He said yes. It was the most catastrophic decision of his life, and Jessica Anthony had been counting on it. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment below where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The office on Caldwell Street was not the kind of place people found by accident. There was no listing in any directory, no website, no polished sign catching the light. Just a frosted glass door on the second floor of a building that smelled permanently of old coffee and damp plaster, with the words Blaze Investigations stenciled in letters that had started to peel at the corners. Andrew had never bothered to fix them. His days followed a pattern so rigid it had become a kind of armor. He was awake before 5, always. He made coffee in the dark, stood at the window overlooking the empty street below, and read through whatever case files were open on his desk. Insurance fraud, mostly. A missing vehicle. A husband someone needed confirmed. Work that required precision, but not much of him beyond that. He had designed it that way deliberately. The instincts, though, those had never left. If anything, losing the badge had sharpened them the way hunger sharpens attention. He noticed things other people walked past. A displaced chair. A name mentioned once and then carefully avoided. The slight hesitation before an answer that should have come easily. He had always read rooms the way other people read faces, and that ability operated independently of everything else that had broken down inside him. What had broken down was harder to explain, and he rarely tried. The blackouts came without announcement. One moment he would be present, thinking, moving, conscious of himself in space. And then there was simply nothing. Not darkness, not sleep. Nothing. And then he would return, sometimes an hour later, sometimes longer, in whatever position or location his body had wandered to without him. He had come back seated on the kitchen floor with no memory of standing up. He had come back behind the wheel of his truck, engine running, parked on a street he didn't recognize 3 miles from home. Each time, the same sensation upon return, a cold, nauseating blankness where the memory should have been, like reaching for a wall and finding open air. His doctor called it dissociative amnesia, a trauma response that had calcified over time rather than resolving. Andrew called it the gap. He did not discuss it with clients. He did not discuss it with anyone. He managed it through structure, isolation, and the quiet discipline of a man who has accepted that certain things about himself cannot be fixed, only contained. He had been containing it for 4 years when Jessica Anthony knocked on his door. It was 14 minutes past 11 when he heard it. 3 knocks, deliberate but not loud, the kind that suggested the person on the other side had debated making them at all. Andrew was still at his desk. He opened the door to find her standing in the hallway, rain-damp and visibly fractured, her dark knit sweater clinging slightly at the shoulders where the water had soaked through. She was young, mid-20s, with brown hair pulled back loosely and strands fallen free around her face in a way that looked less like style and more like a woman who had stopped caring about small things several days ago. Her eyes were wide and brown and very still, the way eyes get when a person has been crying so consistently that the tears have temporarily run out, but the grief is not. Her lips were slightly parted. She looked, in every visible way, like someone in genuine crisis. She said her name was Jessica Anthony. She said her sister, Claire, had been missing for 9 days. She said the police had a file open, but no urgency, no leads they were pursuing with any real energy, and that every hour she sat waiting felt like a choice she was making to let something terrible happen. Andrew studied her the way he studied everything. He noted the steadiness of her hands despite the distress. He noted that she had arrived close to midnight on a weekday without calling ahead, which meant either she had found him through someone who trusted him enough to give out his address, or she had done enough research to find it on her own. He noted that she held his gaze without blinking too much or too little. He noted all of this and told himself it added up to a desperate woman. He said yes. He told her to come back in the morning with everything she had, photographs, phone records, a timeline of the last week Claire was seen. She thanked him in a voice so controlled it almost didn't sound like gratitude, and then she left, and Andrew stood in the empty hallway for a moment before going back inside. He should have asked more questions. He would think about that later, much later, in a room with no windows and his wrists in restraints. He would think about how much information she had volunteered and how little she had actually answered. The first week of the investigation was methodical and strange in equal measure. Claire Anthony, 23, had vanished on a Wednesday. No goodbye, no packed bag, no indication she had been planning to leave. Her phone had last pinged a cell tower 4 blocks from her apartment before going dark. Her car remained in her building's parking structure. The last person confirmed to have seen her was a co-worker named Davis Pryor, who said she had seemed distracted that afternoon, but otherwise normal. Andrew worked the geography first, the way he always did. He mapped the cell tower ping, Claire's regular routes, the location of her apartment, her workplace, the coffee shop she used every morning. He drove the corridors between them at different hours, looking for the kind of detail that doesn't appear in a report because nobody thought it mattered. On the third day, he found the first anomaly. A section of chain-link fencing at the edge of Kellerman Park, 3 blocks from Claire's last known location, had been cut and refastened from the outside. Not broken, cut cleanly, then bent back into approximate position. Someone had wanted access to the wooded area beyond the fence without leaving an obvious point of entry. Andrew photographed it, measured the gap, and felt the particular stillness that came over him when something didn't fit. The second anomaly came 2 days later. A gas station attendant on Marsh Avenue mentioned a woman matching Claire's description who had been sitting in a car outside the station for nearly an hour on the night she vanished, not in the lot, but parked along the side road, partially obscured. The attendant remembered because she appeared to be waiting for someone who never arrived. The car she had been sitting in was not Claire's. Andrew pulled the description, a dark sedan, older model, partial plate, and ran it through every channel he still had access to from his department years. The plate came back registered to a vehicle that had been reported stolen 8 months earlier and never recovered. He sat with that information for a long time. The fencing, the waiting, the ghost car. There was a shape forming at the edge of his understanding, not quite visible yet, but there, the way a figure becomes clear in fog only once you stop staring directly at it. He had seen this kind of careful, prearranged geography before, not on a case he had been hired to investigate. On a case he had worked in his last year on the force, before the warehouse, before everything. He wrote that down and circled it. Then he went home. He woke up on the kitchen floor on a Thursday morning with no memory of the night before. It was not the first time, but the details this time were different, and different was the word that stopped his breathing for a moment when he took stock of himself. His boots were on. He never slept in his boots, and they were caked with dark mud along the soles and partway up the sides, the kind of mud that came from soft ground, wet earth, somewhere that was not pavement. There was a shallow scrape along his right forearm, already crusted over, the kind that comes from catching yourself on something rough when you fall or stumble. His jacket was on the chair, and there was a smell on it he couldn't immediately name, something cold and organic, like turned soil after rain. He sat on the floor for a long time. The gap had taken 8 hours. He knew this because his phone showed 11:47 p.m. as his last outgoing call, a voicemail to his doctor that he had no memory of leaving, and the clock on the microwave now read 7:52 a.m. 8 hours. Gone. And whatever he had done with his body during those hours had left physical evidence he could not account for. He did not call anyone. He cleaned up. He sat at his desk and stared at the case board and tried to think clearly through the nausea that had settled deep in his chest. He told himself the mud meant nothing. He told himself the scrape meant nothing. He told himself this was the gap. It was always the gap. It did not mean what his brain was quietly beginning to suggest it might mean. He almost convinced himself. The police arrived on a Tuesday. There were 2 vehicles, a detective's unmarked sedan and a uniformed unit, and they had a warrant. Andrew stood in the doorway of his apartment and read the document carefully before stepping aside, because he was the kind of man who still believed that procedure mattered even when everything else was falling apart. They were thorough and they were quiet, the particular quiet of officers who already believe they know what they are going to find. Andrew watched them move through his space and felt something cold and precise settle over him. Not panic, not yet, but the immediate and absolute clarity of a man who recognizes the shape of a trap one moment too late. They found it in the storage unit off the back hallway, inside a weather-beaten lockbox that Andrew had never seen before in his life. Claire Anthony's student ID, her apartment key, a bracelet that her sister would later identify on camera, voice-breaking, as the one Claire wore every single day without exception. The detective looked at Andrew for a long moment before he spoke. Andrew looked back and said nothing, because there was nothing to say, nothing that would not sound, in this room, in this moment, with this evidence sitting open on the floor between them, like exactly what a guilty man would say. He thought about the mud on his boots. He thought about the 8 missing hours. He thought about Jessica Anthony's eyes, so wide and so still, the night she stood in his hallway and looked like a woman with nothing left to lose. He was beginning to understand that she had known, even then, precisely how this would end. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going. The interrogation room at Port Meridian PD was exactly the kind of space designed to make a person feel small. Not through size, it was actually quite narrow, but through deliberate emptiness. A bolted table, 2 chairs, a mirror that didn't pretend to be anything other than what it was. The fluorescent light overhead hummed at a frequency that sat just below conscious irritation, constant enough to wear at the edges of your concentration without you fully realizing it was happening. Andrew had sat on the other side of this dynamic for years. He knew every technique being applied to him. The long silences, the folder placed casually on the table and left unopened, the way Detective Harlan Moss leaned back in his chair with the particular ease of a man who believes the outcome is already settled. Andrew had used all of it himself, once. Knowing the mechanics did not make it easier to resist. Moss was methodical. He laid it out without drama. The lockbox, the contents, the mud analysis from Andrew's boots that matched soil composition from a specific section of Kellerman Park where a secondary piece of evidence had since been recovered. He talked about Andrew's history of blackouts as though reading from a medical file, clinical and precise, letting the details accumulate their own weight without editorializing. He didn't need to editorialize. The picture was already complete. Andrew said nothing for a long time. Then he asked for his attorney. Moss nodded slowly, closed the folder, and stood. At the door, he paused. He said, quietly, that in his experience the ones who stayed silent the longest were usually the ones carrying the most. He said it without malice, almost gently, which was somehow worse. Andrew stared at the table and thought about the lockbox. He thought about the precise, deliberate nature of its contents, not scattered evidence, but curated evidence, each item chosen to carry maximum emotional weight. A student ID, a key, a bracelet worn every day. Someone had understood that the story needed to feel personal, intimate, irrefutable. Someone had understood how grief operates on a jury before a jury is even selected. He thought about Jessica Anthony, and he sat very still, and he waited. She gave the interview on a Friday evening, which was not accidental. Friday evening meant the weekend news cycle, maximum audience, minimum immediate follow-up, enough time for public sentiment to calcify before Monday's papers ran anything deeper. She wore the dark knit sweater. Andrew would learn this later, through his attorney, who described the broadcast in the flat, careful language of someone trying not to editorialize but failing slightly at the edges. The sweater was the same one from the night she had appeared at his door. Whether that was intentional or not, the effect was the same. It created visual continuity between the grieving sister and the victim, threading them together in the viewer's mind. She was composed in the way that reads on camera as barely composed. Her voice broke at the right moments, not constantly, which would have seemed performed, but selectively, which seemed authentic. She described Claire as her best friend, her anchor, the person she called first with good news and bad. She described the moment she realized Claire was gone as the worst of her life. She said she had trusted Andrew Blaze because she had been desperate and frightened, and he had seemed capable, and that trusting him was a mistake she would carry forever. She did not accuse him directly. She didn't need to. The framing did the work. The careful sequencing of "I trusted him, and now my sister is gone" placed close enough together that the audience's own logic completed the sentence she never finished. By Saturday morning, Andrew's name was searchable and the results were not neutral. By Sunday, there were people gathered outside the Port Meridian PD with signs. His attorney called it a controlled demolition. She meant it professionally, analytically, but Andrew heard it differently. He heard it as a description of something that had been built to fall, specifically, precisely, with him inside it. He was being held pending arraignment. He had not slept more than 2 hours at a stretch. He had stopped trying to reconstruct the missing 8 hours because the attempt itself was making things worse, the mind searching a space that held nothing and interpreting the emptiness as confirmation of the worst possible explanation. He knew that was irrational. Knowing did not help. He was close, closer than he had ever been in his life, to believing that the thing he had always feared about himself was true. Her name was Daria Osei, and she was not supposed to be working that weekend. She was a forensic technician, mid-level, assigned to the digital evidence unit, the kind of position that rarely appears in news coverage and almost never shapes the outcome of a high-profile case. She had pulled an extra shift to clear a backlog, which meant she was the one who processed the security footage from the camera mounted on the utility pole outside Andrew's building on the night in question. She almost didn't catch it. The anomaly was not in the footage itself, but in the metadata, the embedded timestamp data that records not just when footage was captured, but when individual files were accessed, compressed, and written to the storage drive. Most people in most circumstances never look at that layer. Daria looked at it because she was thorough by habit and because something in the compression pattern struck her as slightly off, the kind of thing that doesn't announce itself but registers as a low-frequency wrongness to someone who has spent enough years looking at clean files to recognize when one isn't. The footage showed no one approaching Andrew's building during the relevant window, but the metadata told a different story. The file had been accessed and partially overwritten from a remote connection approximately 4 hours before Andrew's defense team had even been granted access to the evidence. Someone with technical capability and advanced knowledge of the investigation had reached into the storage system and edited what the camera remembered. More critically, a secondary angle from a private residence camera 2 buildings down, which had not been logged in the original evidence inventory, showed a figure in dark clothing approaching Andrew's building at 2:14 a.m. on the night of the blackout. The figure carried something. The figure left without it. The timestamp on that footage had not been touched. Daria flagged it. She wrote it up carefully, precisely, and sent it up the chain with a subject line that contained the word anomaly, because she was not the kind of person who overstated things. Her supervisor read it on a Sunday afternoon and made 3 phone calls in quick succession. Andrew's attorney received the forensic report on a Monday morning, 40 minutes before Moss was scheduled to return to the interrogation room for what everyone understood would be the session where Andrew either confessed or didn't. She came through the door instead. The investigation pivoted the way large structures pivot, slowly at first, then with sudden, irreversible momentum. Financial records subpoenaed as part of the broader case review revealed that Claire Anthony had recently changed the beneficiary on a life insurance policy worth $460,000. The original beneficiary had been Jessica. Claire had changed it 11 days before her disappearance to a college friend Jessica had never mentioned in any of her statements. Detectives began looking harder at the sibling history. What they found, through interviews with former neighbors, a high school counselor, and 2 people who had known both sisters in their early 20s, was not the portrait of a close bond that Jessica had described on television. It was a long, complicated history of financial dependency, Claire supporting Jessica through 2 failed business ventures, followed by a quiet and apparently permanent rupture approximately 18 months before Claire vanished. People who had known them described it consistently. Claire had finally said enough, had cut contact, had begun building a life that did not include her sister. Jessica had lost the money. She had lost the relationship. And she had recently, according to credit card records, spent $1,100 at a compounding pharmacy in a neighboring county, a pharmacy that specialized in customized prescription formulations. A toxicologist brought in by the defense ran a retrospective analysis on a blood sample Andrew had given during his initial medical evaluation at booking. It had been stored, routine procedure, and never analyzed beyond the standard panel. The expanded screen found trace residues of a dissociative compound, a synthetic agent not commercially available but documentable in forensic literature, consistent with chemically induced blackout episodes. Consistent, specifically, with repeated low-dose exposure over several weeks. Someone had been dosing him, carefully, gradually, keeping the gaps wide enough to be frightening but not so frequent as to send him to a hospital. Building a pattern, building a history, creating a man who could not account for his own movements on the nights that would matter most. Andrew read the toxicology summary in a conference room with his attorney sitting across from him and said nothing for a very long time. Then he said, quietly, that he had always wondered why she had knocked on his door at 11:30 at night when she could have called. She had needed to see him in person, his attorney said. She had needed to know exactly what she was working with. They picked Jessica up at the regional airport on a Thursday, 40 minutes before her scheduled departure. She had a single carry-on bag and a one-way ticket to a city in another time zone, booked under a variation of her middle name. The agent at the gate later said she had seemed calm, not rushed, not visibly anxious, just purposeful, the quiet focus of someone executing a plan they had run through many times in their head. She was calm when they approached her too, by all accounts. She did not run. She did not make a scene. She looked at the lead detective and asked, in a level voice, whether this was truly necessary. He told her it was. She nodded once, as though filing the information, and put her hands forward. Andrew was released that same afternoon. His attorney drove him back to Caldwell Street and walked him to the door and asked if he had someone who could stay with him. He said he was fine. She looked at him the way people look at someone who has just said something they both know is not entirely accurate, and then she left. He went upstairs. He sat at his desk in the quiet office with the peeling letters on the door, and he did not open the caseboard or the files or the coffee maker. He sat in the near dark and looked at the window and thought about the gap, not the one in his memory, but the one that had opened up somewhere deeper, in the part of him that had always believed, beneath everything, that he understood people, that he could read a room, that his instincts were the one thing that had survived intact. Jessica Anthony had walked through his door wearing devastation like a costume, and he had looked at her, had looked carefully, the way he always did, and he had seen exactly what she needed him to see. He was free. The evidence was clear. The case against him had collapsed completely. He sat in the dark for a long time anyway, because freedom and peace are not the same thing, and he understood now, with a certainty that no verdict could touch, that the most dangerous thing about a perfect predator is not what they take from you when they're caught. It's what they leave behind when they go. Subscribe to see how this unfolds, and comment where you're watching from. I would love to say hello to you, just to know how far our story is going.